In the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific was entering its final and bloodiest phase. From March through August, the U.S. military launched a campaign that would change the course of naval warfare. It was called Operation Starvation. The battleground was not a single island or city. Instead, it was the waters surrounding the Japanese home islands, especially the inland sea and the ports of Kobe, Osaka, and Hiroshima. These harbors were the lifelines of Japan's military and economy. Ships carried food, fuel, and raw materials from across Asia to keep factories running and troops supplied. By 1945, Japan's navy had been battered, its merchant fleet reduced, and its air force depleted. Yet, the nation still relied heavily on coastal shipping to survive. The United States set out to choke off this last artery and bring Japan to its knees without a direct invasion. The weapon chosen for this mission was not a battleship or a submarine. It was the naval mine. In earlier years of the war, submarines had been the main tool for sinking Japanese ships. Silent hunters prowled the sea lanes, targeting troop transports and supply ships. But by early 1945, a new approach emerged. Instead of risking submarines or surface ships near heavily defended ports, the U.S. would drop thousands of mines from the air. These mines would sit hidden beneath the water, waiting for passing vessels. The mines used in Operation Starvation were advanced for their time. They were not crude floating bombs. They were designed with different types of triggers. Some exploded on contact when a ship's hull struck them. Others were magnetic or acoustic, set off by the metal of a ship or the sound of its engines. Many had time delay fuses so they would not all activate at once, making it harder for Japanese crews to predict when and where they would strike. The most common models were the Mark 25 and Mark 26 mines. They were large, heavy devices, each packed with hundreds of pounds of explosives. What made this effort revolutionary was how the mines were deployed. In the past, laying a minefield required surface ships to approach enemy waters, often under fire. In Operation Starvation, B-29 Superfortress bombers carried the mines and dropped them at night. The bombers flew at low altitude over key shipping routes, harbors, and narrow channels. From above, the mines parachuted into the sea, sinking quietly into position. This allowed the U.S. to strike deep inside Japanese waters, reaching places that no surface ship could safely approach. At first, the Japanese were caught off guard. Ships began disappearing without warning. Convoys that had safely traveled the inland sea suddenly ran into disaster. A merchant ship might vanish in a flash of water and fire, its survivors left swimming in oil and debris. Captains had no way to know where the danger lay. Each new route risked another ambush. The psychological effect was severe. Unlike enemy aircraft or submarines, mines could not be seen or fought off. Sailors began to fear even routine journeys between nearby ports. The Japanese Navy scrambled to respond. Minesweeping crews worked around the clock, dragging heavy cables through the water to clear safe channels. These men faced incredible danger. Sometimes their own sweeps triggered hidden mines, destroying their vessels. Even when successful, their efforts were temporary. American bombers returned each night to drop new mines, replacing those cleared the day before. The pressure was relentless. As the campaign grew, entire regions of Japan's coastline became unusable. The inland sea, once a bustling highway for cargo and military ships, turned into a deadly maze. By June, the flow of goods slowed to a trickle. Factories ran short of coal and raw materials. Cities faced food shortages as rice and other supplies failed to arrive. The nation's war machine began to seize up, not through direct bombing alone, but through silent starvation at sea. The tactical drama reached its peak in the summer of 1945. B-29 crews reported seeing burning ships from miles away. Sometimes, massive explosions ripped through harbor areas as a mine detonated under a large transport or tanker. For the American airmen, these missions carried less personal risk than bombing raids over cities, where heavy anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters awaited them. Mine-laying runs were quieter but no less important. Each successful drop meant another hidden threat waiting below the surface. For the Japanese sailors, the experience was terrifying. Survivors of mined ships spoke of sudden destruction with no warning. A calm voyage could end in seconds. There was no visible enemy to fight, only the dark sea and the constant threat beneath it. Many merchant captains refused to sail certain routes, knowing they would likely never return. Families at home heard rumors of entire crews vanishing. Fear spread through port cities as losses mounted. By mid-1945, the results were clear. The mines were sinking more Japanese ships than the entire U.S. submarine fleet. In just a few months, over 1,000 vessels were damaged or destroyed. This shocked military planners on both sides. For the Japanese, it meant their last lines of supply were collapsing. For the Americans, it proved that an air-delivered blockade could cripple a nation without a massive surface fleet. As August approached, Japan's maritime network lay in ruins. Even if ships remained afloat, there was no safe passage between ports. Coal could not reach power plants. Troops on distant islands went without supplies. The blockade strangled Japan's ability to fight and survive. Operation Starvation had lived up to its name. This campaign showed that naval warfare was no longer only about surface battles or submarine duels. The silent threat of mines, dropped from the sky, had changed the shape of the war. The oceans around Japan became invisible battlefields where a hidden enemy waited, and the cost to the Japanese people was measured in hunger, fear, and the steady sinking of their remaining ships. In early 1945, the United States had a new weapon to use against Japan. It was simple in appearance, a metal sphere packed with explosives, but its impact on the war was enormous. These were the Mark 25 and Mark 26 naval mines. They were not placed by hand or by ship, as in older wars. Instead, they were dropped from the sky by B-29 Superfortress bombers, the same planes used to carry out the massive bombing raids on Japan's cities. The design of these mines was highly advanced for the time. Some were triggered by direct contact. When a ship's hull hit the mine, it detonated instantly, tearing open the vessel's underside and flooding its compartments. Others used magnetic triggers that detected the steel of a passing ship, even if there was no physical touch. A third type relied on acoustic sensors, set off by the distinctive noise of engines moving through the water. This variety made it difficult for Japanese forces to predict where the danger lay or what kind of mine they were dealing with. Many mines were also equipped with time delay fuses. This meant that after being dropped into the water, they would not activate right away. Some might sit inactive for hours or even days before becoming armed. The Japanese might believe an area was safe after sweeping it, only for ships to strike mines later. This feature kept the pressure constant and sowed confusion among those trying to keep the shipping lanes open. The Mark 25 and Mark 26 were large and heavy, each weighing hundreds of pounds. A single mine contained enough explosive force to destroy a fully loaded cargo ship. The B-29s carried several at a time, flying low over the dark waters near Japan's ports and coastal routes. As the bomber released its load, the mines floated down on parachutes to reduce impact and allow proper placement. Once in the water, they sank to the desired depth, silently waiting for a target to pass above. The way these mines were deployed represented a major shift in naval warfare. Before Operation Starvation, laying mines was a dangerous job performed by surface ships. Crews had to sail close to enemy shores, risking artillery fire, air attack, and sudden confrontation with enemy vessels. The process was slow and costly. In contrast, B-29 bombers could cover vast areas in a single night, dropping dozens of mines with precision. They faced little risk because Japanese air defenses were thin by this point in the war. This allowed the United States to create minefields deep inside enemy waters, far beyond what had ever been possible before. The strategy behind Operation Starvation was straightforward but devastating. Instead of fighting Japan's remaining warships directly, the goal was to destroy the merchant fleet and cut off supplies. Japan's industry relied on shipping lanes for everything from coal and oil to food and raw materials. Without constant shipments, factories would grind to a halt, troops would go without supplies, and civilians would face shortages. The mines were placed in critical choke points, narrow channels, harbor entrances, and busy routes between major ports like Kobe and Osaka. Each minefield worked like a trap. The first ships to enter would often trigger several explosions, leaving survivors and wreckage in the water. Rescue operations were dangerous because the area might still be mined. Even after the initial strikes, the Japanese could never be certain how many mines remained or where they were hidden. This uncertainty forced ships to move slowly, if they moved at all. As new mines were dropped almost nightly, the effect multiplied. At the start of the Pacific War, American submarines had been the main weapon for attacking Japan's merchant fleet. Silent and deadly, submarines hunted convoys and patrolled shipping lanes. They were highly effective, sinking hundreds of vessels over the course of the conflict. But by mid-1945, the pattern had shifted. The mines laid by B-29s began sinking more tonnage each month than the submarines. This was a dramatic change in naval strategy. For decades, submarines had been seen as the ultimate commerce raiders. Now, a weapon that simply waited beneath the surface was outpacing them in destruction. For the Japanese, this was a nightmare. Submarines could sometimes be tracked or countered with escorts and depth charges. Mines could not be fought in the same way. They turned familiar waters into deadly zones. Merchant captains faced impossible choices. If they stayed in port, supplies would not reach their destinations. If they sailed, they risked losing ship and crew to an unseen weapon. Japanese minesweeping units worked tirelessly to clear the paths, but the task was overwhelming. The B-29s dropped mines faster than they could be removed. Crews dragged heavy gear through the water, trying to detect and destroy each mine. It was dangerous, grueling work. A single mistake could blow a sweeper apart. Even when they cleared a channel, the safety lasted only hours before new mines were dropped. American commanders saw the results quickly. Reports showed sharp declines in shipping traffic. Photographs from reconnaissance planes revealed harbors packed with idle ships. Large tankers and freighters sat trapped, unable to move without risking destruction. The mines didn't just sink ships, they paralyzed Japan's maritime network. As more minefields went into place, entire regions of coastal waters became impassable. The inland sea, once a vital artery of commerce, turned into a graveyard of wrecks and blocked passages. This slow strangulation worked hand in hand with the bombing campaigns over Japanese cities. While the bombers destroyed factories, the mines cut off the raw materials needed to rebuild. By the summer of 1945, Operation Starvation had proven its worth. American naval officers were astonished at how effective the campaign had become. The mines were inexpensive compared to ships or submarines, yet they delivered massive results. They sank more Japanese ships than any other single weapon used in those final months. It was a quiet, relentless form of warfare, one that left the enemy unable to fight back. This success did not happen overnight. It relied on careful planning, precise execution, and an understanding of Japan's dependence on sea transport. The B-29 crews flew night after night, methodically sealing off routes and harbors. Each mission added another layer to the invisible blockade. Japan's last lifelines were severed by weapons that did not move or fire, only waited. By mid-1945, these mines had reshaped the balance of power in the Pacific, showing that control of the sea could be achieved not only through battles and fleets, but through silent, patient pressure beneath the waves. In the spring of 1945, Japanese sailors began noticing a strange pattern. Ships that had sailed the same routes for years were vanishing without warning. A freighter would leave Kobe under a clear sky and calm sea, then never arrive at its destination. Survivors, if there were any, spoke of sudden explosions that came without sign of an enemy. No planes overhead, no torpedoes in the water. One moment the deck was steady beneath their feet, and the next it was gone, replaced by fire, smoke, and a rush of seawater. At first, commanders suspected submarines. Submarines had long stalked Japan's shipping lanes, and crews were trained to watch for periscopes and listen for the sound of torpedoes. But these sinkings felt different. There were no sightings, no warning tracks of bubbles. In many cases, multiple ships were lost at once in narrow harbors or channels. The attacks seemed random, like the sea itself had turned against them. Reports began to pour in from across the inland sea. Kobe, Osaka, Hiroshima, and smaller ports all told the same story. Merchant convoys that once traveled safely along the coast were being destroyed. Captains refused to sail at night. Crews whispered of haunted waters, of invisible enemies lurking below. Panic spread quickly, even among experienced sailors who had survived years of war. As the losses mounted, the Japanese Navy realized what was happening. American bombers were laying mines by air, dropping them silently into the sea. This new tactic meant no port or route was safe. The B-29 Superfortress, which had already burned Japanese cities to ash, now threatened the very lifeblood of the empire's shipping network. The first response was swift but chaotic. Minesweeping crews were dispatched to clear the busiest routes. These men worked from small, vulnerable vessels, dragging heavy cables fitted with cutters and charges. When their sweeps caught a mine, they would detonate it at a distance or, if luck was poor, set it off beneath their own hulls. Every mission carried the risk of instant death. The work was relentless. Even after hours of clearing, the same waters could be remined the next night by fresh American flights. The B-29s flew low and fast, often under the cover of darkness. By the time Japanese lookouts spotted them, it was too late. Mines parachuted into the water with barely a splash. In the morning, crews would find wreckage and oil slicks marking another ship lost. The cycle became endless. Sweepers cleared a channel by day. At night, the Americans seeded it again. Shipping companies tried to adapt. They rerouted vessels to less traveled waters, hoping to avoid known minefields. But this only created new problems. Alternate routes were longer and more dangerous. Ships had to move in single file through narrow, twisting passages, perfect spots for mines. Delays piled up. Cargo that once arrived in days now took weeks if it arrived at all. Ports became clogged with waiting ships, their captains unwilling to risk sailing without guarantees of safety. The Japanese military faced hard choices. Fuel and food were running low across the home islands. Factories lacked coal and raw materials. Without constant shipments, production slowed or stopped. Troops stationed on distant islands went without reinforcements or supplies. Yet, every ship sent out risked destruction. The Navy attempted to escort convoys with warships, but this offered little help against mines. Mines did not fear guns or armor. They lay silent beneath the surface, striking any vessel, military or civilian. By late May, the scale of the disaster was clear. In some areas, traffic dropped to a fraction of its former level. Entire convoys vanished overnight. Japanese commanders reported that the inland sea was becoming impassable. Even with every available sweeper working nonstop, they could not keep up. Many sweepers themselves were lost to explosions during their missions. The men who survived described scenes of terror. One moment, they were towing cables through calm water. The next, a deafening blast tore their ship apart. The Americans increased the pace of their operations. As the summer approached, they dropped mines in ever greater numbers. Large ports like Kobe and Osaka were hit repeatedly. These were vital hubs, connecting Japan's industrial heartland to the rest of the empire. Losing them meant more than just sunk ships. It meant a complete breakdown of the transportation network. Japanese civilians began to feel the effects. Food shipments dwindled. Rice became scarce in the cities. Factories producing weapons and aircraft reported shortages of key materials. Coal shipments that once powered the nation's trains and power plants were stranded in southern ports. The mines were not just a military weapon. They were a silent blockade that starved an entire country. By June 1945, the inland sea was all but closed. Only a few desperate ships attempted the journey, and many never returned. The waterway that had once been Japan's safest and busiest route was now a graveyard of wrecks. For the sailors, it was a nightmare with no end. They never knew which turn of the channel would bring death. Even in port, there was no safety. Mines were sometimes dropped inside harbor entrances, sinking vessels before they ever left the docks. Commanders issued orders for emergency measures. Crews were told to keep strict radio silence, to travel only during daylight, and to maintain wide spacing between ships. None of it mattered. The mines struck without warning, obeying no pattern. Japanese officers understood that they were losing control of their own waters. Each night, B-29 bombers flew over the dark sea, unseen and unstoppable. Each morning, Japanese sailors faced new fields of hidden killers beneath the waves. The fight had become one-sided. The Americans did not need to fire a single gun. The mines did the work for them, breaking Japan's shipping network piece by piece. By the end of June, the results were unmistakable. The empire was isolated. Coastal shipping, once the backbone of Japan's economy, had collapsed. The inland sea, a sheltered waterway that had carried supplies for centuries, was silent except for the sound of explosions and the cries of sinking men. Japan was now cut off from its own resources, a nation surrounded not by ships or blockades, but by the invisible, relentless grip of the mines. The war at sea had changed, and no one felt it more deeply than the men who sailed Japan's merchant ships. By the spring of 1945, fear hung over every harbor and dock. Sailors no longer saw the sea as a path to deliver goods or serve their country. It had become a trap, silent and deadly. In Kobe, Osaka, and Hiroshima, sailors waited for their next orders, knowing that leaving port could mean certain death. Some refused to board their ships, even under threat of punishment. They had seen too many vessels vanish without warning. The stories spread quickly through the harbors. A freighter would leave in the morning, its deck stacked high with coal or rice, and by nightfall only floating wreckage remained. Survivors, if they returned at all, described scenes of sudden horror. They spoke of quiet nights when the only sound was the hum of the engines, followed by a violent blast that split the ship in two. Men were thrown into the air, then dragged under by the rushing sea. Fires broke out on the surface as oil and cargo burned. Some ships sank so fast there was no time to lower lifeboats. Sailors clung to planks or barrels in freezing water, watching their ship disappear beneath them. Those who made it back to shore carried memories they could not escape. They knew they might face the same fate on their very next voyage. The fear was not limited to the sailors. Across Japan, civilians began to feel the impact of the blockade. In the cities, food supplies dwindled. Rice shipments from the countryside were delayed or destroyed. Families lined up for hours outside government distribution centers, only to receive small rations that could not feed them for long. Coal shortages shut down trains and factories. Power outages grew common as fuel ran out. Mothers in Osaka worried not only about the bombs falling from the sky but about how they would feed their children. In some areas, people resorted to eating grass, acorns, or anything they could find. Malnutrition became widespread, especially among the young and elderly. The mines in the water had created a silent famine on land. Each ship sunk meant less food, less fuel, and less hope for survival. The collapse of shipping also disrupted everyday life in ways that were less visible but deeply felt. Letters and news traveled slowly or not at all. Families lost contact with sons and husbands serving in distant parts of the empire. A sailor might leave home and never be heard from again, his fate a mystery sealed beneath the waves. The uncertainty gnawed at those left behind. Every knock on the door might bring bad news. Every day without word was another day of dread. In the ports, the atmosphere was tense and desperate. Captains gathered their crews before departure, giving instructions that sounded more like last rites than orders. They told men to travel spaced apart, to keep constant watch, and to be ready to abandon ship at any moment. Some sailors carried small bundles of personal items, knowing they might have only seconds to grab them before fleeing into the water. For the Japanese Navy, the task of minesweeping became a grim duty. Crews went out knowing their chances of survival were slim. A minesweeper could clear dozens of mines in a day, only to be destroyed by one missed device. The men worked under constant strain, their hands blistered from hauling cables, their eyes scanning the water for signs of danger. When a mine was spotted, the crew tried to detonate it safely. Sometimes they succeeded. Other times, the explosion came too close, and the sweeper itself vanished in a column of spray and fire. While Japanese sailors faced this nightmare at sea, American aircrews experienced a very different war. The B-29 pilots and crews who carried out the mine-laying missions saw little direct combat. Compared to the high-altitude bombing raids over Tokyo or Nagoya, where flak and enemy fighters claimed many lives, these missions felt almost routine. The bombers flew low at night, dropping their payloads into dark, empty waters. There were risks, mechanical failure, bad weather, the occasional burst of anti-aircraft fire, but the danger was far less than in daylight bombing runs. Some airmen admitted a sense of relief. They were still part of the war effort, still striking a blow at the enemy, but without the constant threat of being shot down over a burning city. They knew the mines they dropped would do their work silently, long after the bomber had returned to base. Yet there was also a feeling of awe at the mine's effectiveness. Crews who returned from missions sometimes received reports about the damage caused by their drops. They learned that entire convoys had been destroyed, that shipping lanes were closed, and that Japan's inland waters were becoming impassable. They could hardly believe that a few hours of flying could create such widespread havoc. Reconnaissance photographs confirmed the scale of the destruction. Harbors once crowded with moving ships now showed nothing but wreckage and empty docks. The airmen realized they were witnessing something new in warfare. Without firing a single shot in direct combat, they had helped shut down an enemy's transportation network. For some, this raised questions. They understood the strategic value, but they also knew the human cost. Each sinking meant sailors drowned or burned, families left grieving, and civilians starving for lack of supplies. Though they never saw the victims, they could imagine the terror of a ship vanishing in the night. Back in Japan, the effect of the mines deepened as the weeks passed. Sailors began to view every voyage as a gamble they could not win. Some deserted, slipping away into the countryside rather than face another trip through mined waters. Others went reluctantly, driven by duty or fear of punishment. In port towns, wives and mothers gathered to see their men off, unsure if they would ever return. By the summer of 1945, the psychological toll was as great as the physical destruction. Japan's merchant fleet was no longer just losing ships. It was losing the will to sail. The civilians on shore endured hunger and hardship, while the men at sea faced death from an unseen enemy. The mines had turned the water around Japan into a vast battlefield, one that offered no glory, no warning, and no escape. For those who lived through it, the memory would never fade. By the summer of 1945, Japan's maritime network was collapsing. The chain of islands that made up the empire depended on ships to move everything: food, coal, oil, and war materials. There were no long highways or rail lines connecting distant regions. Without ships, factories could not operate, troops could not be supplied, and civilians could not be fed. The mines dropped by American bombers during Operation Starvation severed these connections piece by piece until the entire system failed. In the industrial cities, shortages grew severe. Factories that once produced planes, ships, and weapons stood idle as coal and raw materials piled up at southern ports, unable to reach their destinations. Assembly lines stopped not because of bombing damage but because there was nothing left to build with. Power plants ran out of fuel, plunging neighborhoods into darkness. Even military facilities struggled to function. Communications faltered as the supplies needed to keep equipment running never arrived. Food shortages were even more immediate. Japan imported much of its rice and other staples from Korea, Formosa, and parts of China. These shipments traveled along the inland sea and through major ports like Kobe and Osaka. When those routes were mined, food could not reach the population centers. Civilians lined up for rations that grew smaller each week. Hunger spread through cities already scarred by bombing raids. Malnutrition weakened workers and soldiers alike, reducing their ability to fight or rebuild. The Japanese Navy faced a different kind of crisis. Warships needed a constant supply of fuel and ammunition to remain operational. Tankers carrying vital oil from the south became prime targets for the mines. Many were sunk before they reached home waters. By mid-1945, fuel reserves were nearly gone. Entire fleets were ordered to stay in port because there was no fuel for training or patrols. Even when enemy ships appeared nearby, Japanese commanders often could not respond. Moving a single cruiser or destroyer might use fuel needed to keep hospitals or factories running for weeks. This loss of mobility forced the Navy to abandon large sections of the coastline. Areas that once held defensive strongholds were left unguarded. Small garrisons remained isolated and undersupplied. The Navy's role shifted from fighting battles to simply trying to keep a few lifelines open. Minesweeping became its primary task, but even that proved impossible to sustain. Crews cleared one channel only to see it receded with mines the next night. With each passing week, the number of active ships dwindled as losses mounted and replacements never arrived. For Japan's leadership, the situation was grim. They had expected the American blockade to come in the form of surface ships or submarines, something they could challenge directly. Mines were different. They did not need to be fought in open battle. They waited silently, requiring no fuel or maintenance, yet they inflicted damage equal to entire fleets. Each sunken merchant ship represented lost supplies, lost manpower, and lost hope. The effect of Operation Starvation matched that of the bombing campaigns in its scale. While American bombers destroyed Japan's factories and cities from above, the mines strangled the flow of goods below. Together, these efforts created a complete war of attrition. Japan could no longer rebuild what was destroyed. It could not even move the resources needed to try. By June, intelligence reports showed that over half of Japan's shipping capacity had been lost. Many surviving ships were trapped in port, unable to risk leaving harbor. The Japanese government tried to hide the full extent of the crisis, but the results were visible everywhere. Empty docks lined the inland sea. Markets ran out of basic goods. Military leaders issued desperate orders, shifting what few resources remained from one area to another, always too late to make a difference. Civilians and soldiers alike saw the war slipping away, not through dramatic battles, but through slow suffocation. On the American side, naval planners took note of what was happening. At the start of the war, submarines had been the primary weapon against Japanese shipping. They hunted convoys and attacked warships with skill and persistence. But by the final months, airdropped mines had surpassed submarines in effectiveness. Entire stretches of ocean were closed off without a single direct confrontation. The strategy was efficient and required fewer lives at risk. Commanders began to rethink how future blockades might work. Traditionally, a blockade meant surrounding an enemy's ports with warships, a dangerous and resource-heavy task. The success of Operation Starvation showed that a blockade could be achieved from the air. A small number of planes, flying at night, could create barriers that no fleet could easily overcome. This insight would shape how naval forces planned for future wars, where control of the sea would depend as much on denying access as on direct combat. For the crews flying the B-29s, the results were striking. They saw the reports of how many ships were sunk or immobilized after each mission. They learned that the mines they dropped in silence had caused ripple effects across the entire Japanese economy. It was a form of warfare that felt almost invisible. A single flight of bombers could affect millions of people without ever being seen by the enemy. By late July, the Japanese shipping network was no longer functioning. Convoys had stopped running. Ports were filled with idle vessels, many damaged or half-sunk. The inland sea, once Japan's busiest waterway, had become a place of wreckage and oil slicks. With their supplies cut off, troops in far-flung areas were left to fend for themselves. Even mainland garrisons struggled to receive enough food and ammunition. The Japanese Navy's final attempts to fight back were scattered and ineffective. Without fuel, even the most powerful warships sat helplessly at anchor. Minesweepers, already overworked, could not keep up with the constant rain of new mines from the sky. In some cases, they were ordered to protect only a single vital route, abandoning others entirely. The leadership had been forced to accept that they no longer controlled their own waters. For the United States, Operation Starvation was proof that control of the sea did not always require great fleets or massive battles. The mines had done the work quietly and efficiently, sinking ships and shutting down commerce at a fraction of the cost of traditional naval warfare. It was a lesson learned in the final months of a brutal conflict, one that would influence strategies long after the war ended. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the scale of Operation Starvation became clear. In the months before Japan's surrender, American naval mines had done something no one expected. They had destroyed more Japanese ships than the entire U.S. submarine fleet during the same period. This fact stunned military planners on both sides. For years, submarines had been seen as the most dangerous threat to enemy shipping. Submarines hunted convoys, stalked warships, and could strike anywhere. Yet, in the final stages of the Pacific War, it was not the submarine that delivered the most decisive blow. It was the mine, a weapon that did not move, did not hunt, and did not need a crew. The records compiled after the war told a stark story. More than 1,000 Japanese ships were sunk or damaged by mines laid during Operation Starvation. Many of these were merchant vessels carrying food, coal, oil, and military supplies. Some were large tankers essential to fueling the Navy. Others were smaller fishing or transport boats that connected remote islands to the mainland. The mines had struck without discrimination, attacking the very network that kept Japan alive. By cutting those lifelines, the United States had forced a collapse from within. For the Japanese, the realization was bitter. Their navy had been built around large battleships and carriers meant to fight decisive engagements. Even as their resources dwindled, they had poured men and material into defending against visible threats like submarines and surface fleets. Mines were often treated as a secondary danger, a nuisance to be cleared by sweeper crews. Operation Starvation proved that this thinking was outdated. By the end of the war, Japanese ports were full of wrecked vessels, and entire stretches of coast had been abandoned because they could not be defended against a weapon that could not be seen or fought directly. American planners studied the results carefully. At the start of the war, mining had been a minor part of naval operations. Submarines and carrier groups had received most of the funding and attention. But after Operation Starvation, it was clear that airdropped mines could achieve strategic goals on a massive scale. A small number of B-29 bombers flying at night had accomplished what once required large fleets and constant risk to human life. The operation cost far less than a traditional blockade and caused far greater disruption. The lessons were profound. Future naval strategies began to incorporate mining as a central component rather than an afterthought. In the years that followed, during the tense early days of the Cold War, the United States and its allies looked at ways to use mines to deny access to key shipping lanes. The Soviet Union, too, saw their value. Mines became a tool for controlling the sea without committing entire fleets to battle. They offered a way to exert power quietly and continuously, much like what had been done against Japan. Operation Starvation also changed how military leaders viewed the relationship between air power and naval warfare. Before this campaign, mine-laying had been seen as a slow, dangerous task for specialized ships. The B-29s proved that planes could handle the job far more effectively. They could reach enemy waters quickly, avoid detection, and deploy mines with precision. This concept shaped new doctrines where aircraft, rather than ships, would be the primary delivery system for creating minefields. For the men who flew those missions, the operation was a study in contrasts. They returned home to little recognition compared to bomber crews who had participated in dramatic city raids. There were no fiery explosions visible from the sky, no towering clouds of smoke. Their missions were quiet and methodical, yet the impact was enormous. In interviews after the war, some airmen spoke of learning weeks later how their mines had sealed off a harbor or cut off an entire region from supplies. It was strange, they said, to know they had helped win a battle they never saw. For Japanese civilians, the legacy of the mines was felt long after the war ended. Even months after the surrender, mines still lay hidden beneath the waves. Ships continued to strike them, sometimes long after the conflict was over. Clearing these dangers became a massive task for both Japan and the occupying Allied forces. In some areas, shipping remained restricted for years. Families of sailors who had been lost at sea often never received confirmation of where or how their loved ones had died. The mines had not only destroyed ships but had erased entire journeys, leaving only questions and grief behind. As historians studied the campaign, they recognized its significance. Operation Starvation was one of the most cost-effective operations of the entire war. It required fewer resources than the massive island invasions or the strategic bombing campaigns, yet its results were just as far-reaching. By attacking Japan's economy directly, it hastened the end of the conflict and reduced the need for a costly mainland invasion. Photographs taken after the war showed the inland sea littered with sunken hulls. Harbors that had once been crowded with bustling trade were silent, their piers lined with rusting wrecks. These images captured the quiet devastation of the campaign. Unlike battles fought on open water, there were no headlines about heroic clashes or dramatic victories. The mines had done their work in silence, leaving only destruction behind. The effect on naval thinking was lasting. In the years that followed, navies around the world reevaluated their reliance on visible power. Battleships and carriers remained important, but military planners understood that control of the sea depended on more than direct confrontation. The ability to deny an enemy access to vital routes could be just as decisive as sinking their fleet in combat. Mines, once overlooked, became a central part of this strategy. Operation Starvation showed that a weapon could be powerful without being seen. It revealed that victory could come not from dramatic battles but from steady, relentless pressure. By closing off Japan's sea lanes, the United States had demonstrated that warfare could be waged through isolation and disruption as effectively as through direct attack. The mines reshaped the final months of the Pacific War and left a legacy that influenced naval strategy for decades to come. What began as a low-profile mission grew into a decisive campaign. The airmen who dropped the mines, the sailors who faced them, and the civilians whose lives were shaped by them were all part of a story that unfolded beneath the waves. In the end, these silent weapons proved that control of the sea could be won not just through force of arms, but through patience, planning, and the unseen reach of a mine waiting in the dark.